Hey, hello. Yet another Ask Us Anything. And this episode is a proof that I listened to your comments, all of you. I know that you dislike that me and Scott really hate Helm and think that Go templating is silly. So I brought a person here who loves it to balance the situation over here. That's
Finally,
Ramiro.
finally, some
Finally.
fairness, some fairness in the discussion. Hi, Scott. Hi, Victor. Happy to be here to set the record straight on why Helm is the best.
There we go. You want to
everything
introduce
And
yourself?
we love him despite the fact that he loves Helm.
Yeah, kind of. You need to accept people with their deficiencies. That's okay.
That's why I love you. That's why I love you guys. Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here. Hi, everybody.
You want to introduce yourself? I mean, probably people already know Scott and me, so you might be unknown entity here.
I mean, I hope so. Otherwise, you may have some questioning to do. Hi, everybody. My name is Ramiro Berrelleza. I am the founder and CEO of Octeto. It's a platform for remote dev environments. It's also an open source project of the same name. Happy to be here. If you're interested in platform engineering, remote dev environments, all those fun things, ask your questions and then check out our open source project.
Okay, let's jump straight into the question. So everybody listening, start typing. Do it fast. First come, first serve. No filter. We answer everything, including I have no idea as a possible answer. So from Miloš, how can you gracefully drain connections during Kubernetes rolling updates when using Scratch-based container images, given the lack of shell and tools typically used in pre-stop hooks? I will give a quick explanation how I do it, and then the two of you can jump in. And I'm a bit confused with the question because I suspect that there are other ways to do it that I will learn today. I do it from the code, right? The process that runs in my container accepts the hook and responds back only after all the existing requests respond, right? And while that is happening, no new requests are coming to that container. So I know how to do it from the code. But I suspect that this question means that there is a way how to do it outside of the code, and now I'm completely confused.
Yeah. So it can be done from outside of the code with, pre-stop hooks and whatever, and you can run weird things through pod specs and all of that. I have never done it. I never hopefully will need to do it. And I believe the right way of doing it is always from the code. By doing it from the code, you make yourself agnostic to where that container runs. And today you could be starting before Kubernetes and running in Docker or running in, ECS or Google Cloud Run or at Azure Container Apps. Well, that runs on Kubernetes, unlike the others. But, it could be running in some paths. Tomorrow it's Kubernetes. The next day it's Nomad. And sometime else it's running as a Lambda function, and it will still work. Because the second it's in the code, I want everything in my container as much as possible, and not to be configuration on my pod spec.
Just to clarify, unless I'm completely wrong, that's the same signal that you would get if you execute kill in Linux. Kind of doesn't have to be container. Kind of nothing to do with containers.
Exactly, but right.
The hook, I guess, is no. I mean, the old method of stop receiving requests, give it some time, some 5-10 minutes, then shut it down. Primitive works most of the time, assuming you don't have long running requests. But yeah, I agree with Scott on do something that is not Kubernetes. Like use Kubernetes as like the trigger. You get the event. So then manage it in a way that is independent.
Here's my question then. If you do it from outside the code, how does that something know that all the ongoing requests responded?
I don't think you can. I think that's kind of more of a heuristic of like, if you know that your requests take 30 seconds to be processed,
okay,
wait for 2 minutes, but you're not going to have certainty that everything was drained correctly, which I don't think you could ever have. I think regardless of what you do, your code should handle the fact that you might have to reprocess something, because even with pre-stop hooks and whatever, there's no 100% certainty that your request was drained before it was
Right.
you're done.
Right. The pre-stop hooks is going to be, it runs a command, and when it's done, it stops the container. So the pre-stop hook could be that it's going to run, and it's checking PS, right? It's like if you were running processes, or it would check, network connections, but it's whatever heuristic they decided means that the app is working or not. Right? But yeah, I think it's not a good practice overall.
Okay, from Tommy. Maybe a silly question, but if I build my image and run tests in a feature branch, do I also do this again when I merge them? And I will try not to be the first one to answer always. So if anybody wants
I
to
can
start.
start. I have a lot of
I
experience.
suspect it's your
feature branches
domain, yeah.
and dev. It's a great question because I think it's possible. However, you have to be very careful here because one of the things that we see a lot is with building images is how hermetic your build is and how isolated it is. If you can, because you can do your container image in a way that you always get the same output, but it's not by just doing like a few commands. You have to be more specific on how you're building and adding dependencies. If you do that and you have a good way of tracking, hey, I built this image out of this SHA and this test passed, yeah, you don't have to do it again. I'm always been a big fan of like understanding why you're running tests and what you're testing for, and just running tests to see what happens. It doesn't work at scale. I think you have to be very determined, like why you're running tests, when, and what risk are you hedging, and you can build your containers, and if your tests and your containers always get you the same output with the same input, and you can prove this with whatever degree of certainty you're comfortable with, yeah, there's no reason why you should be running the same tests all over the place.
I guess it also depends on the type of test. Like, I cannot imagine a reason why I would run unit tests of the same source code twice. But then, for example, if I maybe have some specific tests that require me to deploy something, and then on a feature branch, I might deploy it to some ephemeral environment, but I want to double check later when it goes to a real environment, let's say after I merge it, right? So I guess it depends on how much the tests depend on the actual situation.
Yeah,
that you have, right?
That's something very important. When I was at Microsoft, one of the things I really liked about their cloud engineering practices was, which I don't see that this much outside of there, this categorization of tests. Like there was kind of like priorities and depth, and as the changes went through these different processes, is what you said. It was like, don't run unit tests over and over and over again. They take time, resources. No, if you run them and you know the code's not changing and they're proper unit tests, you're good. And then that level of testing, check. And then the exploratory testing was always done at the end, because that's the one that is more like human driven and you try to figure out how to break things. Integration testing happened at a certain stage, and then that was it. And I think ephemeral environments can help you get much farther because you can do more realistic testing early, and then you can be like, yep, I checked this, no need to do it again. But I agree, there's a certain level of verification that the more realistic your environment gets, the more that matters, which to me is the integration points, realistic data, scale, stress, those kind of things.
Yeah, I think it's really like if you're building with build packs, the answer is no. If you're building with Docker files, you definitely need to. The reason is because of what what Ramiro was saying is true. You can build a hermetic build that you get the same output twice in a Docker file. The chances of you doing that are quite low, and the chances of you making a mistake are quite high and making it not hermetic, because something is not the exact same. If you're not zeroing out the timestamps like, build packs do, which, yes, it's weird that my image was built, before containers existed. But by zeroing out timestamps, we can make sure that we get binary sameness between exactly these things. You can do that in Docker file, but if you aren't doing that, you don't know what changed, and I think you do need to run tests again. Again, tests of the image, not tests of the code. The code didn't change when I moved. You don't need to test your code. Any tests you do of the built image, If you are rebuilding again, you need to test that. Now, should he rebuild again? No.
And
Hopefully,
it's not
no.
only that. It's not only that image changes or not, depending on whether you build twice or not, but there is much more than an image of an application, right? There are virtual services and certificates and stuff.
Exactly.
And that's
Is it me or Ramiro got
It's no.
frozen?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Now we
Yes.
I was saying that that's something that's also very different nowadays in the cloud native world, which is the application is not just the code. Like if you're just testing the code, you're gonna miss the most serious one because it's the code, it's configuration, it's the container, it's the upgrade model.
Exactly.
Which is where
I would actually even go that far that code. There are projects I work on that I'm confident that the testing of the code I did even before pushing. That's my least concern. I know that it works because I'm a person who tests stuff locally. I just don't know anything else. I cannot confirm that everything else works.
Yeah, before
Which
I
is
used to work for
why-
this Go ahead, Scott.
Which is why I believe in like Octeto so much and the idea of remote development. Whether it be Octeto or any tools that do remote development, the idea of remote development in Kubernetes, I think, is critical. And the reason is because a lot of times, what are you not testing against? The Aqua or Prisma or whatever other cube security tools you're using that have runtime protection, or the Kyverno policy that's changing my run as user setting, and any of these things that all of a sudden I go and deploy this to production. I tested it as a container. I deployed it to kind on my machine. Everything worked. I go deploy it to production and everything breaks because you're not testing it in a real world scenario. If you're developing from day zero in a real world scenario in terms of the same policies being enforced, then things become much easier. You come up with you find the issues so much earlier and not 3 weeks after when finally the approvals came and it gets deployed to production and it got blocked because of runtime security.
I will make slight modification of what you said. You never test. The only testing of the real world is when it reaches production. You're testing close to the real world.
Correct. You want
Not
as
the
close
real
of
world.
right. You want as close to dev prod parity as you possibly can get within reason of money. Right? Like, I'm not saying deploy the same scale of an RDS instance for dev and production or for every developer to deploy a Postgres cluster in RDS. You can do a Helm chart based Postgres for dev and then do RDS, but do RDS in pre-prod. If you have RDS in prod, don't make that be the first time you touched RDS because things are different, right? As you get closer to production, you have to be closer and closer. But as much as we can get that dev prod parity, the better it's going to be for you.
Quick thing. Last week I forgot to mention, and they might be mad at me, I don't know. We have a sponsor recurring, so quick word from our sponsors, Codefresh, GitOps. If you want to make things easier on you, if you want to have GitOps already set up as a SaaS solution, and more importantly, if you want promotion of your releases between different environments, which is a good segue because we were just talking about environments, you might want to try codefresh.io. You type, what is it, GitOps 2025 over there, you get 20% off. Thank you, Codefresh, for sponsoring this video. Everybody there, type the address, go there. Let them see that this is worth the small amount of money that they're giving. Thank you so much. Okay, back to the questions. If I remember where we were. Okay, during Platform Engineering Day EU talk with Mauricio, there was a statement, do we need to hide Kubernetes from developers? That was Mauricio asking and saying, it depends, and you, meaning I, answer, no it doesn't. Like it's a done deal. What is it? I do think that independently of whether we can do it or no, I think that the whole idea that developers are exposed to entirety of Kubernetes is just silly. Kubernetes is too complex, and why would a Node.js developer or a Python developer or whatever developer spend eternity trying to figure out how it all works? Because it's so damn... I mean, Kubernetes is not it's not complicated for what it does. I don't think that we have easier solution than Kubernetes for what Kubernetes does. But the expectation that we are going to give access, that everybody gets access to Kubernetes and go figure it out, I think that's silly. So I stand behind my statement that no, it doesn't depend whether we should hide it. We should hide it, period. Just as we are hiding hypervisors from people who want to create VMs in AWS or Azure or whatever. Now, whether everybody is there, whether we are there as an industry or we are getting there, how easy or hard it is to get there, that's a separate conversation. But the goal must be, I want to run my application. That must be the goal. It must be Heroku-like eventually.
So
and it's a hill I'm going to die on.
I disagree with you completely. 100%.
Okay.
I believe we should not be hiding Kubernetes from developers. I believe we should be building good abstractions, and that's what Kubernetes is good as, and making Kubernetes easy for developers. There is a huge difference. I do not want to hide. Hiding was the #1 mistake of Crossplane, that it may not have been the reason, but of cluster scoped resources where I have the claim and it's in a namespace and now everything else is hidden away. It's like auto magic. I create my claim and ooh, boo, all this stuff happens, but I'm in a namespace and I don't see it. That hid away all of the implementation stuff from the developer. Bad, 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 bad. I do not like black boxes. In my mind, I think that's bad. I think that letting them know it's Kubernetes is great. They should be able to see the resource hierarchies and see pods and see replica sets and see deployments if they want to. They should never need to create a deployment, but they should be exposed. The interface for them should be the Kubernetes API with custom-baked APIs built through Crow, Crossplane, custom CRDs, Kubevela, I don't care what tool it is. But that should be their interface, and we should not be hiding it. We should be building better, higher-level abstractions, which is what Kubernetes is meant for, not for running containers.
Yeah, you actually, I feel that you actually explained better what I wanted to say. Kind of, I don't literally mean hide it, kind of you can never see anything related to Kubernetes. I mean, hide it below abstractions that make sense. And it would be your choice whether you go deep into it or that abstraction. Assuming that resources based on that abstraction give you the information that you most likely need. Afterwards, it's your choice. But yes,
right.
I feel that we agree.
Right. Which
Yeah,
I
but
think
I
is
wanna-
hide implementation detail, I would say, is the important thing. You want to hide
Yeah.
implementation detail and not hide Kubernetes. Or you want to not have leaky abstractions. Let's put it at that.
One thing I would like to add to this that I think it's important to mention, because when people talk about do we hide Kubernetes, the difference between it's not there and what we're talking about today is very important, because I've talked to very well-known companies where their point is like, no, developers have code running on their laptops, maybe on a container if you're lucky, and developers should never even know Kubernetes is there. And kind of like what we were saying earlier, like modern applications are more than just a code. I think that's where it's very important as an industry to understand the difference between providing the right abstraction. It's like when you're building a desktop app, you don't want to hide the fact you're running on Windows, because you have to react to the fact you're on Windows. You have to follow a certain style, certain experience. The same thing happens with cloud-native applications. If you're building something for Kubernetes that's meant to run on Kubernetes, you need to know that. You need to leverage that for better or for worse. Like you're going to write code for cert management if you know that there's something already provided by the platform. But this idea of like completely hidden, just write code and don't worry about it, and later we'll put this in a container and it will automatically work on Kubernetes. I think that's a mistake that a lot of companies do. And it goes back to, like, for me, why this hill of ephemeral environments that look like production, and why I believe that Helm and Kubernetes are tools developers need to use as they write code and not just at the end when they're deploying, is so important, because I think it's a huge difference from it's abstracted, but you're using it, to like it's not there, and later you'll see what happens. which is what a lot of like the platforms, especially internal platforms, do. Like I've seen many companies build platforms where like all of this is hidden, and then when it fails, no one knows what's going on.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree with that, but still, I feel that people are not going far enough. Like you mentioned, the cert manager, right? There shouldn't be a need for you as a developer to define cert manager. You should know that there is one,
Yeah.
right? But you can have abstraction that you say, I want certificate, true or false.
Right. TLS
And there is a
should
cert
be, the
manager, and
developer
you
should
can
know
see it.
TLS is config. Right? Developers should
Yeah.
know that TLS enabled true. He doesn't care how it gets implemented, but he should know he does not implement TLS in his code. Right? He does not need to implement that. He does not need to implement circuit breaking in his code. That you can say, you know, what you want, and Service Mesh will take care of that for him. Service Mesh will take care of this, and Cert Manager will take care of that, and Ingress will take care of this, and all these things will take care of what they need. But it is config, and they need to understand the difference between config and code, and that needs to stay even when we move to abstractions. We can make the abstraction easier. No one should need to know external DNS.alpha. Whatever it is, annotation for a service to create a DNS record. It should be FQDN. I'll figure out the annotation as the implementer in the backend, what that means, right?
Okay, next one from Ben. Hi, Victor. It's addressing to me, but no, actually, only I can answer. What do you think about Tech Hub in Barcelona? Are there any good companies worth working for? I'm a wrong person to ask that question because I have a very negative view on tech in Europe as a continent. I think that we are very much behind in Europe. It's a whole continent, and I feel that kind of it's not even close to US. When I say US, I don't mean people working. There are brilliant people in Europe, just to be clear. I'm talking about kind of where does the company originate, kind of where are the headquarters. I think it's most of the things happening in US, a lot of things happening in China, and a tiny city of Tel Aviv has more companies than the whole continent of Europe, which I think is a shame. So I'm very negative towards the whole continent.
I think it's
not only
magnificent.
Barcelona.
I think it's
Huh?
magnificent, Victor. I think it's great. What a tiny little city.
I wonder where Scotland.
Exactly. I may be biased.
I would like to.
No,
I would like to add. No, you're right. I mean, I don't know if you're right. I don't want to get into that, but I think something that's for all of us in tech, and I know I'm the founder of a company, and I don't know, my company is actually half between Europe and the US. My co-founders live in Madrid. I live in San Francisco, and we kind of hired in both places. And I think that's something very interesting that is happening nowadays, where you don't have to be constrained by the local tech hubs anymore. Like I think Victor's a good example of someone who works in a world-class organization that is not headquartered in Barcelona, or I don't think they even have an HQ. So as you think of your next step in your career, that's a huge leverage that we in tech have that almost no other industry has, which is companies have hubs everywhere. Some are remote first, others are hiding in a bunch of different geos. So we have that opportunity to, like, you don't have to necessarily move to a city to work for great companies there. So think about it from that perspective, because I think that even though there's like a bit of a backlash right now on like moving back to in person, there's still a lot of really good organizations hiding remote first. And Spain in particular has a really good cost of living versus tech salary equation that is very favorable compared to London or Berlin or San Francisco.
One thing I can say is that if you can get okay, so I'm going to be punished for what I'm about to say, but search for a startup who does not yet know how cheap cost of living is in Spain. Get lower salary than in US, but still not much lower, and you're gonna live like a king. Don't go for Ramiro's company because they know how cheap it is in Spain, but go for some company that does not know that yet.
No, but for the founders out there, it's very competitive because it's like it's cheaper, great talent, and you're able to pay a very fair salary that people do a very good living, and you
Yeah.
have access to really good talent. So I think it works well. I always say that Spain is kind of a very underestimated tech country because a lot of good talent, strong universities, big interesting like experiences there. But yeah, the cost of living has nothing to do with that. Like London is absurd how expensive England is for the salaries compared to Spain.
So here's a question to you, Ramiro, because you're the only one here who actually is a C person in a company, right? If you're remote or mostly remote company or spread across the world, let's say that I'll limit this conversation to Europe and US only, but applies to the whole world. Kind of, does it even make sense for you to hire in US, excluding specific roles? Because kind of you're going to give double the compensation, and that person will be unhappy with that
Yeah,
compensation.
it's a very interesting question because there's a big it depends, but there's two different things that you have to think about when you're hiring in different countries. No, one is the cost, of course. I think matters. No, like you want to be around for a while. You want to manage your expenses. However, you also have to think of what you're getting for that cost, because in tech, especially early stage, which is where I like best, a really good hire, a really good engineer gives back to the company like 10x their salary. So I think it's very important to think about cost, but also it's very important to think about what this person brings to your company. I'm going to be like blunt here. There are certain roles and certain level of expertise that you cannot hire, I'm going to say, outside of San Francisco right now.
Yeah.
And it's always been like that. It's like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you wanted to hire experts on DevOps, there was a huge concentration of DevOps people in SF and Seattle because this is where it started, Puppet and Chef and Docker and others. Now with AI. But as the internet and people like Victor, like Scott, kind of talk about it and democratize this to more people, it gets easier. So it's an equation. It's tricky, and then there's all these opinions. But I think that salaries are important, but value as well. So it makes sense to hire in the US, especially if you're hiring people who have experience in startups. It's a very different mentality when you come from like scrappy startup versus working, in like a gigantic bank. And a lot of people in large corporations have a hard time transitioning to startups because they just don't know what to expect. They don't know. Startups are messy. Most of the time, you don't know what you're doing. You're trying things. They require high agency and independence. If you're used to working in a big company, that is not rewarded on big companies. Big companies work on planning and stability. So that's an advantage of hiring in the US is you can bring this kind of talent, and then when you mix it, then that they can become role models for others. Because one thing that I've seen a lot is like, if you've never been exposed to anything, you don't know what you don't know. So it's like, oh, I didn't know I could just go and build a feature because I think it's great. And here's more like, that's expected. You're a senior engineer. You should be telling me what to build. So I like the mix for that reason. And I think that's important. But I think as the startup culture, and this is very startup specific, as the startup culture grows and the build fast MVP kind of culture becomes better understood across the world, I think it's going to matter less to hire in the US specifically. But today, there are roles, technologies, and certain level of operational expertise that is very hard to find outside of I would say the startup hubs in the US.
Okay. The next question,
I think the
only
one other
Ramiro.
thing that's really important on this is culture.
Go for it.
Right. The one other thing that's really important is culture. Because one of the challenges we do see in a lot of companies is the culture is very different between San Francisco, New York, and deep, Montana. Even in go within just the US, just go between states, right? You go then to Europe, and Spain is very different than London or Paris, right? The cultures, Israel, go to China, go to, anywhere in the middle, go anywhere, India. The culture is so different, and that can be a huge benefit. And that can also be a major challenge depending on the size of the company, depending on who manages the company. So there can be pros and cons of, where you hire from. That's purely just a cultural matter of how it's going to work and how the team nature is going to be.
Okay, the next question, Scott, you're not allowed to say anything, and I will not say anything either. How would you structure and manage Helm charts for multi-environment, multi-tenant Kubernetes deployment pipeline to ensure minimal duplication, clear versioning, and secure secret handling? Oh wait, there is more. While still allowing for environment-specific customizations.
Beautiful. I think this is where Helm shines, to be honest. Scott, you're not allowed to say anything. It's a big question, and separation of concerns is very important. Like, I think that Helm is a language. It's a way you define what you want to do. And what I like about Helm is the customization, the power of you can customize, you can define conditions. I like that a lot about Helm. When you're talking about multi-environment, multi-tenant, and we used to run a cloud, like a free SaaS version of our product years ago. And it was like that. It was defined in Helm charts, multi-tenant, multi-environment. So it's possible. I would start by kind of what we were saying before. When you think about tenants, you have to have a very clear abstraction of what you want to expose to the tenant. And I think that's where most Helm charts get it wrong, where you want to expose everything. Like the best Helm charts I've seen are the ones that are kind of the same thing that Crossplane gives you or KRO. The few things you care about. Like, for example, if you're going to use secure secret handling, don't expose the full structure of secrets. Your chart is like, you are going to give me a key where I'm getting the secret from. And then the chart knows that you're using Vault, that you're using external secrets, whatever it might be. You have to think in this kind of like platform approach. Remember that Helm is about creating resources. It's not going to replace your business logic. It should not be used for like security and boundaries. I think you need to layer a lot of things, but definitely like clear abstractions, not exposing too many things. I think try to expose the least amount of parameters you can until things get hard, and then expand. And I think I can get you very, very far. And define your tenancy. If you're going to do per namespace, make sure that every resource is namespaced and clearly labeled. One of the things we got wrong in the past was not using labels efficiently and not using namespaces with good, like easy to discover names and those things. Because once you have that, then you can leverage things like Kyverno, network policies to create those boundaries for you. Think of it, maybe it sounds like overkill, but the platform mentality, I think, can be applied. You can create a very simple platform that is very effective just with Helm charts. Like we're helping this one customer, and I can't name them, but they're building their platform. And step one was like, hey, create these common Helm charts and make sure everybody calls the same Helm chart to create a database. And the Helm chart internally is using Crossplane or whatever, but from the umbrella chart is great. PostgreSQL, this version. That's all they care about. And if you go small building blocks, I always go back to the 12-factor app. I think the principles of the 12-factor app make a lot of sense when you think at this level. And leverage Helm for what it's good at, which to me is the expression, the templating, the customization, but use that tool effectively and do limit the scope. That always helps a lot. And small building blocks, in my opinion, are better than this very complex superhero in a way. And don't be too afraid about duplication. I think that has a very bad rep. Many, many times in my career, I think duplication would have solved us for a lot of pain that we tried to cover with abstraction. Duplicate, and once it becomes a problem, then fix that, because it's very hard to identify when duplication is actually not really duplication.
One problem I feel that happens far too often, independently whether we're talking about Helm or anything else, is that very often those are different people, consumers and builders, let's say, and they often build it for themselves instead of for the people who will consume it. I'm referencing now when you said limit the number of parameters, right? Very often people think, those are the 5,000 parameters that I might need for that. Instead of thinking of what does the person who will actually use this chart, in this case, need? Or whatever that abstraction is, doesn't matter, right? And I feel that that's the trap. It's such a silly trap, but almost everybody falls into.
It's pretty much. I think it's premature optimization, right? It's like, oh, let me think of all the magical ways they can use this, rather than what do they need this week, this month, because whatever you do, and I say this as I've been a practitioner of this for many long time. Whatever you do, you're gonna get it wrong. Whatever you think is gonna be wrong, and if it's not wrong on day one, it's gonna be wrong in 6 months because things will change and ideas will shift. So build something simple. Don't over optimize. Don't expose the entire model, which is something when I was learning Crossplane, I always made that mistake of like, oh yeah, expose every parameter. And then you're like, then why am I using Crossplane? No, the whole point of Crossplane, which I really like, is the premise of what Scott was talking about, the abstraction. Expose the 2-3 things that matter.
It's also really easy to add another knob. It's almost impossible to take away a knob from someone. If you expose something, taking it away, there is a good chance you will break someone. If someone comes and complains that they need an extra knob, then you can add it. So start with the bare minimum and then add as it's needed, I think, is always a better approach. The other thing I would say on that, though, is just like I've always said with platforms, and the same thing when you're building anything as a service. With platform as a product, and you can take that to what Ramiro was saying, that a Helm chart could be a minimal viable platform like type of thing. Like at some levels, like you could build a platform with this as like tools. We can view it in that same way. And if we do, platform as a product means I go to my customer and ask them what they want, and then I build the abstraction. Where platforms fail is when the DevOps team or platform team or IT team or whatever team it is thinks they know what the developers want, work for a year and a half to build what the developers want, show it to the developers in every single use case that has ever happened in humanity have come and said, what in the world are you talking about? This has nothing to do with what I actually need. So ask the user what they would want. What do they care about when they're deploying Postgres? If it's a Postgres Helm chart, what do you care about? I care about A, B, and C. Great, that's what I'm exposing to you. Don't think that you know what someone else wants. Ask them, because otherwise you'll get it wrong.
If you have no idea, I mean, I think that Ramiro, I bet he will agree. Kind of like if there is a person who knows within an hour or a day what users want, please come and join us. We still didn't figure it out as a product where I work. Kind of like it takes years to figure it out, and after years you still feel that you're at the beginning of discovery what users want. Kind of, exactly. And then all of a sudden when people build something internally, kind of, oh, I know what they want. Of course I do. That never works.
Right.
You have to be very flexible. You always have an idea, and then you put it out there, and people are going to use it in awful, terrible ways that you never intended. And when that happens, it's amazing. And then you bring that back in and iterate, and it never ends. That's what I like about tech. The cost of iteration is very low compared to any other industry. Like you cannot build a new car every year, but you can refactor your code every day, every week, if you have the right testing and versioning in place, and that's amazing. So leverage that. And as Scott said, talk to people. It's more about that, and then you can layer things and use technology to enable that. And I like versioning. I like that Helm is infra code, is in a repo, is readable. For a lot of organizations, the fact that you can clone a repo at a specific tag makes the breaking changes also a lot easier, because you can make changes and then pin to the previous version and bias, but then if you have realistic environments, you can test the changes and minimize the risk of breakage.
You said something very, very complicated, Ramiro. You said talk to people. I don't know how it's younger generation. In my generation, I'm old. Kind of most of the people who ended up in tech ended up there because they are afraid to talk to people. Most of us were people who never communicated with other people. That's how the whole industry was built. So I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish there, Ramiro. But okay.
Number one skill, if you want to invest in your career, is learning how to distill knowledge from your users. Talking metrics, but distilling that knowledge, it's a superpower.
So from Nikos, how would you design a Crossplane setup to provision and manage infrastructure across multiple cloud providers while enforcing tenant isolation, resource quotas, and GitOps-driven lifecycle management, especially in self-service developer platforms? I feel that part of that answer we already covered with Helm, because there are many points that are very similar. For for tenant isolation, I'm not even sure that that's specific to Crossplane. You need to decide whether namespace is enough or a cluster is enough. And if you decide it's a cluster, I strongly suggest exploring vCluster as a way how to separate tenants, because having depending on the size of the operation, having different cluster for each tenant might be quite challenging on many levels. Resource quotas, I don't think that that's specifically a big problem, and GitOps-driven lifecycle management, that's kind of applies to Crossplane just as anything else.
Well, and then it says, especially in a self-service developer platform, I would say backstage software templates or port, whatever, that what they do is whether it's, the plugins that I built that Victor showed, or the port thing, that I like, that existed as well, or exists, excuse me, that, is a form that in the end does not apply to the cluster. It just generates the Crossplane manifest and shoves it up to Git. Like when you build a self-service developer portal within a developer platform as an interface to your platform, the portal should never actually create anything in your cluster. It should read from the cluster, it should push to Git, and your cluster should be reading from Git and pulling from Git. That's the cycle, right? Portals never talk to Kubernetes. Don't tell that to the guys at Red Hat. They shouldn't. They should never write to Kubernetes. Don't tell the people at Rancher or at Red Hat. They wouldn't like that answer. But they should never write to Kubernetes. They write to Git, and Git gets pulled from the cluster using Argo CD or Flux or any GitOps tool. It gets pulled down, applied, and then the portal reads from the cluster and visualizes it. That's the cycle that should be for a developer, and then that has nothing to do with Crossplane or any other CRD or API. The same flow applies.
Okay, Barbarossa, hi, love your videos. I was 2 years on everything engineer startup. Now I'm 3 years OpenShift platform engineer. I can maybe be an architect next year. Is this smart? I don't know whether I can answer whether that's smart, because different companies have different expectations. In some companies, being an architect is kind of your 20 years of experience. Kind of that's your last job. In some other companies, it's much less demanding.
Right.
Any of you have a take on that? I don't know how to answer this.
I agree. I mean, the first thing is like, do you want to be an architect? Are you gonna get joy out of it? My career, I've always chosen is this what I want to work on, rather than worry too much about the titles and things. If you're good and passionate and work on things that make a difference for your company, I have a feeling that your career will work itself out. I would say understand the expectations of architect. I took an architect promotion when I was an Atlassian. And Atlassian back then, it was like you either became staff or architect. And they were completely different roles. And I didn't really understood it at the time. I thought, oh yeah, you get promoted. Next thing. And no, architect was kind of expected to be more kind of almost outside facing, understand your customer needs, high level, upcoming technologies. Staff was more about working on big, deep projects. So make sure you understand what the company expects of an architect before you decide if that is a good path for you.
The problem I feel is that probably does not apply to none of us, what I'm going to say, but there are companies, more traditional companies, in enterprise companies, maybe banks. Basically, the only way to get a raise is to stop being a developer. Yeah. Which is very bad. I prefer much more, but I'm aware that that does not happen often. Kind of, hey, do what you're really good at. If that's architect, great. But kind of, it's amazing when you're in a company where you can just choose to be a developer and you become an amazing developer and you get bigger salary over time without having to switch roles.
Yeah. The other thing I would say from experience, like in whatever, talking with a bunch of companies and whatnot, is architects, if you care about being good at your job, in order to be a good architect, you have to be very passionate about your job and being willing to work in off hours to test things, learn things, read blog posts, all of that. Because the second you leave a hands-on job, the data that you leave hands-on and go to architecture, the time starts ticking until that technology is outdated. And if you are not passionate enough to go and continue to learn about what's new in the new version of React or the new version of Angular or of Spring or of Kubernetes or of whatever it is, if you're not passionate enough about it, you may be a great architect for a year, 2 years, 3 years, but then it dies down because you become less relevant. If you are interested in architecture and you're really passionate about, let's say, Kubernetes, being a Kubernetes architect can be an amazing job. If you are willing to put in the effort to stay up to date with Kubernetes, even though your job is not necessarily that, because they don't expect that hands-on experience from a Kubernetes architect. But if you completely move away from hands-on, your architectures, the distance between them and reality will also be way too high. You'll start building solutions that feasibly are possible, but the connection between that and reality is, night and day.
And just one last thing very quickly just came to mind, like from my personal experience. And, the architect role, as Victor said, means different things in different places. But in my experience, the architect role requires a lot of politics because you end up having technical leadership without people leadership. So nobody has to listen to you. So you have to develop influence and intention. And that's a whole different set of skills that you might not want to develop. So think about that as well.
More from Barbarossa. Another question. At my current company, work is flexible, but I don't learn anything new, only maintenance and top-down. Would it be worth to go to other company that does new projects for lower pay? And my answer is going to assume that kind of you can afford. Very often you cannot afford lower pay, just to be clear. So that's not an option. And then, I was in that situation in the past and kind of like I cannot accept lower pay. But if you can accept lower pay, I would change. I would switch for lower pay to be in a company where I actually where I feel comfortable and where I learn, where I have opportunities any time of the day because I see it as investment, right? There are companies where within a year in that company, you will be much more desirable than 5 years in some other company afterwards. So I would say yes to that immediately, as long as I can afford lower pay.
And that's key. You don't want to feel the pressure of you cannot grow if your base is not stable. So if you have to worry about, am I going to be able to make my expense of the month? Don't do it. If you're okay with change your lifestyle or saving less, I agree with Victor. I have personally done it in the past where I took substantial salary cuts because I wanted to work in certain technologies or certain companies or certain environments. And I learned a lot. I grew. Eventually that paid off. But salaries are tricky because we all have different needs and expectations around money and how we value that versus other things. But all things equal, I agree with Victor. I would.
Okay. Jumping a bit ahead with Thomas. Thank you, Thomas. This is amazing. Thank you so much. $20. Scott will get another camera soon. Look at him now. We can see him. My company cyber team is rolling out policy that prevents AKS deployments that has auto-mount service account token true in services and pods. Argo CD has this configuration all over. What's the easiest way to resolve this? I will not give a straight answer. Okay, go for it.
Use Flux CD. It doesn't have that.
I will give an answer that is not really answer to this question. Much more my feeling, my dislike. I really have negative opinion about any team, including security teams, that propagate new rules without giving solutions. Independently of what that something is. I think that that's a very bad practice. That's an easy road, kind of like I can easily create 50,000 security rules, right? The challenge is if you come up with a new rule, you need to come with a solution that will enable people to follow that rule. If you don't do that, you're not doing your job right. Independently of whether we're talking about this specific case or any other. What I don't know now is how to. I'm not even sure Argo CD has this configuration all over. I'm assuming that you're talking about installing Argo CD, not applying applications, right? Because applications don't have such a thing. If it's about installing Argo CD itself, I mean, I would open a Jira ticket to security team and say, okay, do it.
Yeah,
and maybe get fired.
Yeah, if it's for your applications, we went through that in our SaaS, and we ended up kind of modifying the manifest to create the service account and the token. It's a good change. I think it makes sense from a security perspective, but you have to change your manifests. That's the way we did it. I prefer to use Argo or Flux as orchestrators, but not as automagic. And that's why we put all that into our manifest, so that regardless how you're deploying, we try to make it so that whether you do Helm install by hand or Argo, you get the same output. But I guess it's about installing Argo CD.
Yeah, it's Argo CD itself has that in its deployments. And that's one of the things that is a shame, that Argo hasn't done what the Kubernetes ecosystem is said to do for the last 2 years, which is change to using the token exchange, whatever the API is that allows you to exchange credentials and get temporary tokens instead of using persistent bearer tokens that never expire. I would have thought that Argo CD would have followed a best practice of Kubernetes in the recommendation for the last 2 years, but then again, their permissions are in CSV files inside of config maps. So, best practices, Kubernetes, Argo CD don't really go well together.
One thing I will say is that things change, situations change, and independent of whether this is the case or not, switching for a different tool when the situation changes that might better fit whatever that situation is not the end of the world. Shouldn't be.
Right. Correct.
Okay. Oh, we got another from Akiva, $10.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Wow. Amazing.
Thank you.
Is it because I'm in the show?
This never happened before. Oh, no,
This
Ramiro, honestly,
happened.
you're coming again.
Maybe it's Scott's new camera. Now they can see Scott. Now they're like,
all right, yeah, maybe it's one of the two. Two changes happened. We have Ramiro, now we have Scott, who is visible. Maybe he's so much more appealing when you see his face. Who knows? And another one from Akiva, $10. Oh, wait. If we keep talking, then people keep... Amazing. Thank you, everybody, so much. This is really helpful. This is really, really, really cool. Where were we? Now, going back from Bol, what do you think about running Kubernetes inside with canonical LXD versus Incus LSD? I don't use self-managed Kubernetes. I have no answer. Scott, Ramiro.
I'm on the same boat. That's Victor. I'm K3S.
We're spoiled.
Open eyes to me, and that's as low in the abstraction as I'm willing to go. I'd rather work in high-end stuff.
I don't use LXD. The only thing from Canonical that I have touched or believe in at any level would be Ubuntu as the operating system or Canonical MAS for managing bare metal servers. Beyond that, LXD, which I know Canonical, I think it was in 2023, they took ownership over LXD, in which case I would say probably makes sense to use Canonical LXD over someone else if Canonical are the maintainers of LXD. But then again, I don't know enough about LXD or LXC or any of that in order to actually give a good opinion, except that the vendor behind it typically knows it better than the vendor who isn't behind it, I would think.
From Tommy, would you advocate for putting front-end apps in Kubernetes if other services are already there? Now, let's exclude from this conversation that there are cases where you might not want to use Kubernetes at all, right? I don't see why wouldn't you.
I don't see why the front-end app wouldn't be the first app in almost every company to be the one in Kubernetes, being stateless and so easy with ingress or gateway API. It's like typically really like this is an interesting one in my opinion, because almost every company that I go to, the first apps that go into Kubernetes are the front-end apps.
Interesting.
Because they're the easiest, they're the most stateless. They gain the best benefits out of horizontal pod auto scaling, things like that. Very easy. You don't need to deal with state. You don't need to deal with any of that. It's just like the easiest thing. They're typically using more modern frameworks, making it easy to containerize. They're less so, big, thick Java application monoliths that you need to break down, or .NET big monoliths. That's typically the first thing. So if it's not there already, yeah, bring it into Kubernetes. It's great for that.
I have a counterpoint here, because something we're seeing a lot of our customers, especially with Vercel, Netlify, and Cloudflare workers, there is an aspect where benefiting from a global CDN can make a difference for your front-end application. I think most of us don't have that problem because that's kind of a high-skill problem. I see that as a point where it might make sense to move things to Vercel or Netlify for front end. But the more systems you bring into your pipeline, the more the orchestration, the more that you have to worry about access control. Like if you have a front end in Vercel and a backend in Kubernetes, then how do you control access between those two services? Then you have to figure out your authentication or service to service. So I'm biased, of course, because we run everything in Kubernetes, so I think that's better. But at a very high scale, it's a different story.
I see the use case of using, let's say, Vercel, just to keep with it, right? If you don't want to deal with complexity with Kubernetes, and especially if you don't have the experience with it, right? But I have difficulty understanding the scenario in which, for example, you would have a Kubernetes cluster, you would run applications there, and then some other put to Vercel. I'm not sure what the advantage is.
But if I read the question,
it's like Ramiro said with scale. If you have certain things that are like bursting of major scale, where Vercel can scale up on Black Friday, let's say, they can scale up your application with no issues, with no waiting a minute and a half for Carpenter to add the new node for my cluster, to it then go and pull the image to start up my image. So it can be instantaneous. So if you have a very fluctuating front end in terms of usage and things like that, make that someone else's issue and not yours in terms of scaling. Maybe that's a benefit.
Yeah, I would say the technology, but search online for Yotpo. This is a company that we work with, Yotpo. They wrote out they did this write-up of how they use Kubernetes, Cast.ai, and a few other things for their Black Friday loads. Super interesting. And I believe it's all in Kubernetes. But a lot of this comes to skills. But if you already have things on Kubernetes, I think there's a lot of benefits of moving your front end also to Kubernetes. Ease of use, single platform, same deployments. You can leverage all the Kubernetes
it's more
things
secure.
that Scott mentioned.
It's more secure. I don't need to expose via ingress my backend. It can stay with cluster IP within my cluster, and nothing needs to leave the cluster in terms of traffic. It's actually safer when I do that. I need to expose less to the public world. But yeah.
Okay, jumping forward again. This is going crazy. I don't know what happened today. This is amazing. Barbarossa, thank you so much. And he's thanking Scott. Very cool. We got new member Thomas, amazing. And another question. We're rich. We're gonna start a new startup now. What's the biggest mistake teams make with dev environments on Kubernetes? This is you, Ramiro.
That's a great question. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen is teams deciding, okay, we're in Kubernetes. Great, developers, figure it out. Here's the code. Here's kind. Do it. Because then you go from this world of like, you have a few clusters, maybe one dev, one test, one staging, one production, to suddenly you have 1,000 clusters because every developer is running a cluster locally. Every developer needs to figure out why is kind not working. How do I upgrade it? How do I run this kubectl? I think that is the biggest mistake. And we talked about this earlier today of like not providing the right abstraction, because you don't want your front-end developers, really, you don't want them to learn Kubernetes and PVCs and that. You want them to be great at React, great at UX, but you do want them to leverage automated dev environments. So the first thing, and that's why we started, that's why I started Octeto, and this was kind of the hill I die on, is developers need access to Kubernetes. They don't need to be running kubectl and troubleshooting things. That's why we built our product the way we
They
built
can.
it.
They don't have to.
They don't have
Right?
to. No. But you don't want to force like, hey, every developer, Kubernetes bootcamp, because it's a waste of time for a lot of the talents, right? But you do want to enable them. So I think that's a big one that you have to be careful about. With any technology, is dev environments, the right abstractions make a huge difference. And it's very hard. And there's a lot of vendors and consulting companies that can help, or internal knowledge, but it's very hard to get it right. But if you get it right, it's a huge multiplier.
Okay. Question from Thomas. Are you going to prioritize support the questions? I have no idea. Because this never happened before. I don't know what this is. This is something new. Never thought about it. I'll think about it.
VIP lane for questions.
What are the best resources for learning current Kubernetes practices, considering rapid obsolescence of many tools? I don't care. It's not books. I can tell you that. If it's rapid, I don't know. This
is a good question.
Conferences.
I'm gonna hear I think this kind of channels. I actually watch DevOps Toolkit. I do watch it. Whitney's channel, which I always forget the name, is also great. I'm biased because I know them personally, but I think they're great ways to learn. Cube Simplify is another good channel that I follow. Siam's channel, I think especially for beginner kind of thing. But I have a question that I shared with Saba, which is, where do you learn more high level, from practitioners? One of my personal challenges with Kubernetes, KubeCon, for example, is that if there are too many beginner talks, where do the architects stay on top of things? How do you do it? You two are really good at this. How do you do it?
At the contributor summit at KubeCon. I think KubeCon is one of the better conferences in terms of the fact that they really do have every level, though, and there is enough to gain for anyone at any level. If you're a beginner in Kubernetes, you will learn so much at KubeCon. If you are a maintainer of Kubernetes, you're going to have a great time at KubeCon and you're going to learn a lot. And there is just so much we can learn from one another. It's such a thriving community that I think that KubeCon, KCDs, Cube Days, all of those things I think are awesome. I think that community the Kubernetes community has done the best job of any that I've seen in these conferences of really not making it about marketing, except for maybe the keynotes. But everything, and I never go to keynotes because of that, but all of the actual sessions are great. And the hallway track is the best way to learn. The hallway track is much better than the actual tracks. And the reason that I say that is because every session that was at KubeCon is already on YouTube. What isn't on YouTube? The hallway track. If you weren't there, you weren't there. You can go on YouTube and watch Victor in a kilt on YouTube. It is there for eternity. You can't talk to Victor for eternity in the hallway at KubeCon, though. So there's a big difference between that. We can always enjoy. I already took a print screen of it and have that as like my desktop showing Victor in a kilt just because it's hilarious. And it like scares everyone. But it's amazing. And but that's my general thing. I think also watch one of the things that I used to do, go to the Kubernetes Slack, join 100 channels, and what you do is literally just like open up the groups and just like click read all, read all, read all, read all, start from a scratch place, come back in a week. Go to every channel that you joined and see how many messages there were. I've done this a few times. And all of a sudden you see, if a group has no messages, great, delete it. Not relevant. If something has had 5 messages in the week, okay, it's alive. If you go to a channel, it's like, oh, wow, there were 600 messages in the last week here. Okay, this is definitely something that I should look at. So before I go and look at a project, I go and join that channel on the CNCF Slack, Kubernetes Slack, Crossplane Slack, whatever it is. Join it for a week. Don't even look. Don't spend my time on it. Go back and see how active it is. Because if it's active, awesome. That means that there's a community. That means that it's breathing, it's living. That's something that you should look at.
We are over the hour. Last question. Let's do one more. That's it. I'm sorry to everybody. There is a bunch of messages we cannot handle. This is amazing. Next week, we'll be here again from Shabir. By the way, I said at the very beginning, first come, first serve. So, how do you guys handle development environments? I feel that this is going to be Ramiro again. I have worked, or maybe Ramiro under the bus. We'll see. I have worked and seen all different solutions like Octeto, MirrorD, etc. But I think they all fall short at some point. Now, Ramiro is a relatively short guy, so I don't know whether that kind of...
I do fall short in many places. Compared to Victor, at least. No, that's a good question. I mean, take this with the bias that I am the founder of Octeto, I'm part of the team that started this whole thing. I'm curious, like how you think they fall short, but definitely a lot of the work we do, and this is one of the challenges with dev environments, is that it's like any other platform efforts. It's a continuous effort. A lot of the work we do with our customers, more than with our open source, but with our customers, is kind of doing these engagements where you sit with the prospect, you talk about their needs, and then you map this architecture together. I think the expectation of dev environments to just work, while amazing, is not real, especially in complex enterprise environments. So I think where they fall short, and we're working on this, and that's what we've been doing this for like now 6-7 years, and I feel like we have like a V1 maybe at this point, and we need to keep iterating. They do fall short because, yeah, you do require work. You have to adapt sometimes your code to the environment. Dev environments, I don't think are going to be like a drop-in, it just works kind of thing. I know some vendors claim that, and maybe for simple scenarios, but when it matters, when you have complex, bunch of resources, multiple, you have Crossplane and databases and hundreds of microservices. I think that's where it's very important to think long-term. However, not every technology is good for every use case. Like, we're very focused on remote dev environments, where things are running in Kubernetes. We believe that's the best path forward. That's the best path to get a realistic dev environment, whether it is one environment per developer or like a split. We call it divert, but like a split environment between staging developer. That's your call. Other solutions prefer the remocal approach. You have to pick the tool that makes the most sense to you and have a clear goal of what you want to accomplish. And then, as Victor said, don't be afraid to change tools. If you pick one tool, let's say you pick Octeto, and it falls short of what your needs, don't be afraid to, one, reach out to the vendor, talk. Why? Maybe there's some, like, I know we need to do a much better work at docs because our product is a lot more expansive than the docs sometimes say. But also sometimes, you know what, I talk to a lot of our customers and say, hey, yeah, I don't think this is good for you. You should try other tool because of XYZ, and that's important. It's a continuously evolving space. I am super excited that there's more companies with fresh ideas, tackling this from so many different directions, everything local, everything remote, in between, on containers, on whatever the weird thing that Flux is. It's amazing.
I d- without knowing what it fell short in this case, uh, I cannot imagine a scenario where it falls more short when it's remote or remote, either of the two, doesn't matter, than purely local, right? Because whatever, there are so many things that you need to do that is already done for you, and you need to build on top of it when it's remote, that even if it falls short, it must be falling even shorter when it's pure local. It cannot be less. Uh, it cannot have less faults, let's say.
I would say that one aspect where you, and it's not maybe I'm going to sound maybe defensive, but I'm going to go with this. Sometimes it feels like it's falling short because a lot of times you're measuring your dev environment just for your personal use case. And I think especially in teams, you have to think of how dev environments enable the throughput of your team, of your organization, because maybe some tasks you feel are slower or a bit harder because you're the one doing it. But when you think of like there's 10, 15 people doing the work, sometimes or many times with platforms, what's best for the 15 might not be the best for the one. And that's something you will have to be very careful when we measure the effectiveness of these technologies. Is my team shipping more? Or is it like me doing more just myself at the expense of the team? That's a hard balance to understand, and you have to kind of ask a lot of questions and look around, but something to consider. It is part of what I love doing with our users, customers, prospects, is kind of helping them evaluate, is this helping you? Is it helping the org? Is it helping the individual? Ideally both, but sometimes you have to make decisions that tilt in one or the other. And that's an interesting aspect of that experience.
And I would say also just one thing, which is I think remote development environments work great when you are working in Kubernetes native architectures, things that are meant to work in Kubernetes. If you're doing distributed monoliths within Kubernetes, or you're doing all these weird, whatever topologies of all these interdependencies between things, it very likely is not for you, or the complexity of it, or it's going to fall short. It will not fall short if you're doing true microservice-based architectures and you're doing things in like the correct way. It's going to work great. It will also work for other scenarios, I believe. But it will fall short typically the further away you move from the 12-factor application, the further you move away from composable applications. If, for example, I was dealing with a customer that has over 700 microservices in a single application. If you have to deploy all 700 microservices and 4 databases inside of a single dev environment and give that to each developer, yes, it will fall short. What will fall short is the, patience from your CFO as well. Right? Like, not going to work. But if that was a microservice base where it's completely decoupled and I only needed 3 services to test out, right? Great. So now it is scalable. So a lot of times it fails because we try to impose this above situations that just shouldn't be there.
I think that's not even. We can expand that. I don't think that's even directly related with development environments. I would more generalize it and say that the more you deviate from the way that platform you chose, in this case Kubernetes, is meant to be used, the more pain you will experience, right? The more you embrace it, the better. Kind of don't try to reinvent the wheel. Like, this is a silly example, but hey, if your application is writing logs to a file because that's what you were doing 30 years ago, maybe, just maybe, it makes sense to invest into writing it to std out because that's the expectation from the system, right? And that cost of changing how your application or something else operates might easily be much smaller than adapting everything else to it so that you just don't make that specific change. There are many changes you might need to do.
The issue is it's a different person that's responsible. VPRND is in charge of making the change to the code, and the CIO is responsible for for modernization. And therefore, it comes to, okay, you spend 10 times as much time. I don't care. I'm not going to spend the time, right? That's where you get into these fights of the amount of change from the Spring developer to do to STD out instead of use this library that sends is 1 day. For me to build something around that is 5 days. But this is R&D and this is IT. IT lose. And spend 5 days.
And then you have a CFO who owns the cloud bill and says, no, you have to spend less. This is one point where I actually, for once, it's not that often. I completely agree with Scott on this one. I think dev environments and remote dev environments are actually particularly helpful when you have those big distributed monoliths, because you cannot run those locally. You cannot run 700 microservices locally, but you can run, it might be expensive, but you can run 700 microservices on a cloud cluster. And of course, there are other challenges. And I actually wrote a blog post on this specific topic yesterday. So go to our blog and Octero.com, check it out. But the idea is we've done this a lot where we start with these gigantic distributed monoliths. And part of the work we do with dev environments is to help these organizations go from that to what Victor and Scott are saying of like following best practices. And to me, one of the big advantages of having this remote dev environments that you can spin up and destroy and do whatever is you can do this experimentation. You can slowly move things to the better architecture. And that's much harder to do when you're running everything locally. And, you know, whether it's Octero, like as well, I don't like to talk about Octero at this topic. It's like the space. Any of the remote dev environments, even if you do your own, there's a huge value here on leveraging the infinite scale of the cloud, the ease of use of Kubernetes, of like create resource, destroy resource, nothing left behind. You can't do that on your local machine. It's very hard. So I think in that aspect, it helps a lot. And there's a lot of upcoming technologies. We're building some things. Other companies are building them as well to help you manage this. I have a gigantic environment, and then you only want to work on a few microservices and do the whole redirection of things that make it easier. And a lot of our very successful customers go from monolith to pure cloud native, and remote dev environments was a key tool in that progress. Again, not necessarily Octero, talking about the concept and the principles behind ephemeral dev environments.
By the way, I agree with you that it's value. So if I wasn't, I think the value may be way more. So I can agree with you. The value is way more for the monoliths. But when you have those, that's also where the pitfalls or where the challenges of the dev environments are really going to show up. Something can be a drop-in solution for remote dev environments for microservice-based architectures. That can be done. Yeah. For the distributed monoliths, it can't. There will be pitfalls there. The value it brings, even with that pitfall, will be huge. But it's still, that's where the pitfalls happen. Right? So,
but it's still, those, going back to what I was saying before, I agree with both of you, but those pitfalls are going to be even greater. Let's say that huge monolith, right? You simply cannot run it locally. So yes, you will have pitfalls remotely, but you will be able to get somewhere at least. Right? Locally, you're not getting anywhere unless it's a really simple setup. I have applications that I don't run remotely because they're a tiny thing that my hobby stuff, right? Nobody cares.
The number one feedback we get from adopters of open source or it's very funny or commercial is the battery of my laptop is now like double what it used to be because I don't have to run all these monoliths locally. One person I remember was like, "Hey, I can Slack and develop at the same time." Because I'm no longer running this gigantic monolith on my, and they had like fancy, MacBook Pros, whatever. There's a limit.
It doesn't
There's only
matter.
so
It's
much.
an Electron app. It's an Electron app. It takes up so much. Slack is terrible. I love Slack, but being an Electron app means that it just loves that memory. It loves it.
I mean, it's just there. It's just standing there unused. Why would you not like chew on all this beautiful RAM?
Exactly.
But yeah, I agree with Victor. I mean, this has been my life for the last 5-7 years, moving remote. It is a great step forward. I think love to see all the tooling around to make it more consumable, easier, more seamless. I think that is the key, is finding a way to make it transparent. Good abstractions, but it's it solves that one problem that you cannot run things locally if they're big enough or too many. But anyway, I don't want to talk too much about that space. But hey, I'm online. If anybody wants to keep talking about dev environments, that's what I love doing. So
Okay, with that note, probably half of the questions we didn't reach. This is amazing. Come next week. We'll be here. See you all next week.
Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.
bye. Thank you for having me.